Order.
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good morning, members. Minister's statement. Minister Acknowledgments Gooden and the Minister responsible for status of women.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge International Women's Day. International Women's Day is held annually on March 8th to celebrate women's social, cultural, and political achievements throughout history and across nations. International Women's Day also provides an important opportunity to showcase commitments towards women's equality, to raise awareness, and to highlight initiatives towards gender parity. The theme of this year's International Women's Day is Better the Balance, Better the World. As the Minister responsible for the status of women, I am committed to achieving gender equality throughout our society. To me, the theme, Better the Balance, Better the World, means having women at the table making decisions that affect our everyday lives for the benefit of all. Women make up half the population of the Northwest Territories and the world. It is only reasonable to expect that half the people in a position of power should be women. Mr. Speaker, gender equality is something many nations aspire to. Far too often, we fall short of achieving that goal, but it is not impossible. We have to work together to get there. Here in the Northwest Territories, we're taking steps towards gender equality. When we passed a motion in March 2018 to increase women's representation in the Legislative Assembly, we collectively said we support this initiative. When we set up the special committee to increase the representation of women in the Legislative Assembly, we demonstrated our willingness to work together to improve the gender balance in this House and to open important public discussions on how best to do this. There are many exciting initiatives both within and outside of government right now. The Trailblazer event, campaign schools, TED Talks, and various leadership events. Our young women and girls have great potential to be our future leaders. We need to provide them with the support and tools to reach that potential. Providing better access for women to education, affordable housing, healthcare, employment, and childcare helps women, but it also helps build a sustainable economy and benefits our society as a whole. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that women continue to face gender-based barriers and discrimination. These obstacles make it difficult for women to get an equal footing. We must continue to work together to develop and implement strategies to eliminate these barriers, prevent violence against women and girls, update policies and programs to promote the development of women in leadership positions, and continue the momentum to take action to achieve gender equality. I thank all Northwest Territories women for their invaluable contributions to our society today and throughout the year. Mr. Speaker, I invite each member of the Legislative Assembly to join me in recognizing International Women's Day. Masecho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statements. Minister statements. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to visitors in the gallery. We have here with us is Len Turcott from N.W.T. here with us today. And with her is Anita Turcott and also Bridget Huff, both from Toronto. Welcome to the Northwest Territories and welcome to our Assembly. Violet Camps of London.
We also have Violet Camps of London here with us in the gallery. Welcome.
Member statements. Member for Trinidad Willowday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today we celebrate International Women's Day. The purpose of this commemoration is to bring attention to and advocate for the advancement of women in all areas of our society. On this day, we acknowledge gender inequalities and celebrate the empowerment of women. According to official website for the International Days Women, this year's theme is Balance for Better, which is a call for action for improving gender parity across the world. In honor of this theme, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to discuss the issue of women representation in electoral politics. This issue has been studied by many bodies, including the United Nations, Parliament of Canada, our own legislature of the N.W.T, and our own legislators at N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, the United Nations determined that in order to achieve significant policy change in government, all parliaments must attain a 30% threshold for women. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, our current legislative assembly in this assembly does not meet that threshold. Our legislature consists of just 10.5% women. However, there are other political arenas within the N.W.T that have exceeded 30% and I'd like to highlight some of them today. For example, in our last 10 federal elections from 1988 to 2015, 5 of 10 elections were won by a woman, and that candidate was named Ethel Blondin Andrew. More presently, Mr. Speaker, since 2015, our capital city of Yellowknife has had the city council consisting of 37% women. In addition, as of 2018, 4 of the most populated communities in the N.W.T all elected women as mayors, with Rebecca Alty in Yellowknife, Candace Jameson in Hay River, Natasha Kulakowski in Inuvik, and Lynn Napier-Buckley in Fort Smith. In addition, there have been 5 Dene communities where they are currently led by female chiefs, which includes April Martel of Hatludeche, Becky Cayenne, West Point, Wanda Pascal, Tetlichi Gutchin, Bernice Furlong of the Inuvik Band, and Frida Marcellus of the South Slave Salt River First Nation. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member statements. Okay, no diet. Sajasura. Tane karion. Dami kaniwale. Want to get anyone? Member Trinidad Willowday. Sajanogi. Minister. Member statement. No doubt.
Merci. Also, 2 of 5 of the regional Grand Chiefs within the Dene Executive Council are women, with Bobby Joe Greenland as Gwich'in Grand Chief and Gladys Norwegian as the Detro Grand Chief. Mr. Speaker, while these stats have improved over the years, both within the territory and across the country, I know that our society can do better. In fact, in our upcoming territorial election, I hope to see women running in every single of the 19 ridings in the N.W.T. Even better, I hope to see at least 6 or more women elected to our legislative assembly to meet the 30% benchmark that all parliaments should aspire to attain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ika Godden and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like most of my colleagues, I want to say something in respect of International Women's Day. In past years for International Women's Day, I've spoken about my mother. She was an independent businesswoman, a single mother, and I couldn't imagine there was anything my mother couldn't do. When you grow up in that kind of household, there's no doubting how capable women are. We're fortunate in the North, Mr. Speaker, that we have plenty of strong examples of women in leadership. I'm not just talking about the women in this room or the women who were chosen as mayors and chiefs in elections last fall. Certainly, they are important role models and examples of successful women, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm talking about the strong, articulate visions that were presented at the independently organized TEDx conference in Yellowknife just before Christmas. Visions of academic and professional achievement and success. Visions of strong balance between role in family and leadership in the community. I'm talking about the strong representation that emerged through the public consultations of our special committee on increasing the representation of women. Those hearings identified some of the inherent barriers to increased participation of women in politics, barriers we must all be aware of and commit to confronting. Our role as leaders should be to look forward, Mr. Speaker, and to imagine what's the best that we can do, what's the best that our family, our community, and our territory can be. And once we have a vision of what that is, Mr. Speaker, it should be on us to design a means to get there. I believe our territorial will be stronger, fairer, and more capable if we have more women in positions of leadership and power. It's an election year, Mr. Speaker, both in our territory and across the country. Maybe that's an opportunity to take some steps forward in representative democracy. Maybe it's a chance to get a little more balance on the ballot. Mr. Speaker, on this International Women's Day, I'd like to encourage more women to get involved, get to the meetings, share your ideas, put your name forward. It's time for every level of government to more accurately reflect all the people we serve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike, go down in the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to speak about a very special young lady from the Nahende riding. I've had the pleasure to witness her grow and develop into a leader since she was in grade 7. The person I'm talking about is Janelle Bruno. She's a daughter of Doris Palissy and Daniel Bruno. Her mother is from Wrigley and father is from Fort Smith. She's very thankful for their continued support and guidance. After graduating, she wanted to see what Canada had to offer, experience a different culture, face new challenges, and meet new people. McGill University gave her all this and more. Janelle is in her 4th year and has taken geography as her major. She explained it is a diverse program that focuses on the physical and social environments that shape people's life. She finds the courses very interesting. Her minor is in Indigenous Studies. It's about critical engagement in the Indigenous topic. It's about how Canada engages with Indigenous people and about diverse history of all Indigenous people across Canada. Beyond her studies, Janelle has been part of a group that is trying to make the campus safer and more inclusive for Indigenous students, since the university is well known across the world for their programs. Unfortunately, sometimes the university doesn't seem to understand the difficulties Indigenous students face. Another thing the group is trying to do is change the men's varsity team's name, the Red Men. The group has been working on this for the past year or so. It's about educating the masses about how offensive the name is for Indigenous people. Because of her advocacy, she has faced pushback from alumni and the varsity teams. Despite the reaction to this initiative, they have been successful, and the principal of the university seriously looking at their concerns. A decision will be made in April. Janelle feels that there is a need for more support for students who choose to study in the South. This support is vital for the success in academics and essential for students to return to the North as effective members of our Northern society. Janelle encourages all students to have the strength to face adversity while chasing their dream so you can become successful and proud of yourself. I wish her all the best and look forward to seeing her become one of our future leaders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike, go down in the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is March 8th, and that means it's International Women's Day, which gives us a clear opportunity to celebrate the contributions of women. As an ally, I do not wish to put words in the mouths of others, but wish to stand behind and support the actions, initiatives, and fights that are being led by women leaders, from coast to coast to coast and around the world. Our society, cultures, country, and lives are enriched daily by the tireless efforts of women with whom we coexist. Today is a chance for all of us to celebrate the achievements of the all too often unsung heroines in our lives and to renew efforts to achieving greater gender equity and equality. I want to commend the honourable members of this House for making women's political equity a top priority of this government, and in particular recognize the ongoing leadership on this and so many other issues by the honourable member for Yellowknife Centre and the honourable member for Range Lake. The political lives of women have often been fraught with challenges. In the Canadian context, I must note the work of the 5 incredible, strong Albertan women for speaking truth to power, Canada's famous 5. Henrietta Muir Edwards, Louise McKinney, Nellie McClung, Irene Parlby, and Emily Murphy fought tirelessly for many issues, but their most long-lasting and wide-ranging struggle was for women to be recognized as persons under Canadian law. Now, this might seem quaint today, but the struggle is not over. It has merely become more nuanced. I want to thank and show my reverence to the battle these women fought for their common sense acknowledgement that, yes, indeed, women are persons. In more recent news, the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould is in the middle of her own battle. The truths and facts are battling out, and we see and hear many of the same talking points by her opponents as we have heard in the past. Whatever the outcome, Ms. Wilson-Raybould's belief that she is, quote, always willing to speak truth to power is a lesson that we can all use a reminding of. It is not easy to stand against one's colleagues, but it is important to stand one's ground, have your perspective heard, and to work tirelessly for meaningful action for change. Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my statement today in the words of another woman who advanced our understanding of radiation and who ultimately paid the price for her work. And I hope that that serves as a reminder to us all that the road to progress is long and must be fought for. Madame Marie Curie, I was taught that the way of progress was neither swift nor easy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On the occasion of International Women's Day, I would like to speak about what we are doing to promote women in leadership. I attended the lively public hearing in Yellowknife on January 17th by the Special Committee on Increasing the Representation of Women. There were about 30 participants, including media, and I would like to commend everyone for the respectful dialogue and the ideas that were put forward. There were three main themes presented. One idea was to run elections for a woman and a man in each riding in the N.W.T. to ensure that half the MLAs are women. This is an interesting idea, but would probably not work, as not everyone identifies as binary. Several presenters said that guaranteed representation of women through temporary seats raises issues of tokenism, may not address the root causes, and may lead others to request guaranteed representation. Last and not least, some participants endorsed the idea of temporary special measures or guaranteed seats as the only way to create the revolutionary change that is needed to ensure that women take their rightful place in decision-making here in the Northwest Territories. There was also some discussion of how we can make the Legislative Assembly a friendlier place for those with young families. This special committee has its work cut out for itself, and I thank all the members who have volunteered to serve on it during this last busy stretch of this Assembly. I've participated in some of their meetings and truly appreciate the work being undertaken by the members who have volunteered to serve. The special committee is still accepting written submissions. I look forward to their report and encourage further input from Frame Lake residents and everyone in the Northwest Territories. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is International Women's Day. This day was first recognized as a global event by the United Nations in 1975, but its origins go back to the early 1900s as women fought for the right to vote. It is a day for celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. The day also marks a call to action for gender equality. It is a day acknowledgeable and support women's rights and to celebrate their many significant achievements. Over the last 100 years, women in many countries have made advances towards gender equality by fighting for labor rights, protection from violence, access to sexual and reproductive health, equal pay for equal work, as well as reaching the highest positions of leadership. However, there is still a long way to go. As of 2017, there were only 15 female world leaders, while the number of current female leaders has more than doubled since 2000. These women still represent fewer than 10% of the 193 UN member states. According to the World Economic Forum, 33,000 girls under the ages of 18 become child brides every day, and women in rural parts of Africa spend 40 billion hours a year collecting water. At the current rate of progress, They estimate it will take 108 years to close the gender gap. This is a notable statistic given the theme of this year's International Women's Day is Balance for Better, which acknowledges that everyone benefits in a gender-balanced world. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member statements. Okay, no doubt that so the sewer the neck carrying the amic animal. What to get anyone? Member saw two such in the member statement down there.
Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, there's some positive progress to take note of. More girls than boys now complete their secondary education in 32 of 34 OECD countries. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing a growing interest for women in all our aspects of society. This past October 2018 territorial municipal elections, 4 of 6 mayor positions were taken by women. I hope to see more women in serving as elected MLAs in the House by this time next year. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge all women in the N.W.T and their important achievements on this International Women's Day. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to honor an late elder on this day, the International Women's Day, late elder Elise Gargan. She was quoted in sharing her stories in the Book of Elders, Nahe Choke, and usually I read it in Slavey, but this time I wanted to read it in English. These are quotes from Elise Gargan. Elise Gargan was born on March 12, 1926, upriver from Fort Providence. Quote, when I was young, I really loved the elders. I used to wash their clothes and heat water for them so they could wash, just as if they were the parents I never had. I believed that for every cup of tea I placed before them, I gained one more day on this earth for myself. I enjoyed doing these things for them out of love. No one ever taught me to work. I watched others, then I'd try. If I didn't sew something properly, I'd undo it and try again until I could do it. If you keep on trying, eventually you'll succeed. I married when I was 15 and really had a hard time struggling to survive. Nowadays, we live in luxury compared to how it used to be. Life was especially hard for the woman. When the man is away, the woman had to feed the children. No matter how cold it was, I had to check the snares. Before I left the children, I had to tie a leather thong around the waist of one and tie the end to something stable, put another in the swing cradle, and leave the elders to watch them all. That's how we used to live. The lower points of my life were hunger and sickness. We didn't know how to help each other when there was sickness and there was no doctor. Sometimes we boil herbs. Sometimes just thinking of getting better helps you overcome. When you're out in the bush, you sometimes experience real physical pain. It was especially difficult giving birth. Sometimes you didn't know what to do, and you are very thankful if your child is alive. Quote, the land gives less now. Once it was so new and very beautiful. I wonder if our children will ever have the experience of living on the land as we did. But the loss of this way of life has come in their generation. Education will give them a chance at another way of life, now that many of them are no longer available to survive in the bush. I see, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize the youth advocate from Nunukput. Mr. Speaker, Ms. Shakita Grubin is a 24-year-old Inuvialuk from Tuktoyaktuk who loves their culture, family, and people who call this northern region home. Shakita comes from a very cultural-oriented family who taught her the values of her traditional lifestyle, yet the importance of education that is needed in today's world. She recently completed a 2-year term in December with the Tuktoyaktuk Community Corporation as a director, and during that time she has worked with the Hamlet of Tuk and for the Tuktoyaktuk District Education Authority. This young woman used these opportunities to grow and learn, utilizing her young voice and taking action. Mr. Speaker, Chiquita has helped contribute in tourism development projects with the hamlet of Tuk, and has done a lot of work around climate change by collaborating with scientists, researchers, politicians, and the media to showcase the impacts for climate change and how it's affecting their lifestyle, causing them to adapt. There's now a community-based monitoring program that recently launched by the Tuktoyaktuk Community Corporation to help educate the people and be part of the environmental concerns, adding it into the Mangalalek school curriculum and colliding traditional knowledge and Western science data together. Mr. Speaker, this young woman with her passion has had a lot of support and help to make these initiatives possible. Chiquita has also volunteered a good amount of her time to visit schools and inspire youth to take advantage of opportunities that come up in this region. She has supported them by filling out paperwork and helping them to fundraise to travel for youth conferences in Canada. Mr. Speaker, Chiquita herself knows that these positive initiatives and knowing your cultural identity makes an impact and is meaningful. She has traveled to many places in Canada and abroad, to Alaska, attending meetings. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, she was our youth representative for the Canada C3 expedition that went from coast to coast to coast for Canada's 150th birthday. She was on leg 12 and the ship left from her hometown Tuktoyaktuk and ended in Prince Rupert, BC. Ms. Grubin has sailed for 20 days, stopping along communities to help build relationships, connect and educate Canada on key themes such as diversity, inclusion, reconciliation, youth engagement, and the environment. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank her for her remarkable contributions to our society. P90, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Godanen and Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources works with communities on plans to reduce the risk posed by summer wildfires. Implementing these plans is really important. We all know of communities where residents had to be evacuated when the fires were burning too close. It is typical for communities to cut a fire break around the community, which is a widely accepted way to reduce the risk of both life and property. Cutting fire breaks is especially important in our small communities, which have limited resources for fire departments, let alone capacity to take fast action to defend against wildfire moving in. The department knows of this, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, its review of the previous year's terrible fire season resulted in a number of recommendations. One of the most important was the need to encourage communities to fire smart to protect their values at risk. I want to be clear, the values at risk are lives and homes and businesses and community halls and offices and schools and gyms. There's a lot more, but you get the idea. It seems that it is far easier for communities to get encouragement than it is to get money to actually do the work. The reality is the fire smarting a community costs money and our communities do not have it. Mr. Speaker, I am told the Department of Environment and Natural Resources used to fund communities for fire smarting, but now expects the communities to use their capital funding to do it. I want to say the department passed the buck on this, but it is more like the department is not passing on any bucks to do the job. We all know about the huge shortfall or the funding gap that communities face for years when it comes to capital funding. Communities are already being shortchanged for funding to meet pressing infrastructure needs. Telling communities to cover the cost of fire smarting is just adding insult to injury. It won't get the work done. This leaves communities. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Massey. Member statements on Canada such as who are the neck cardion de Amik anyone. What do you anyone? Member Mackenzie Delta, such as no member statement about that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. This leaves communities scrambling for dollars through funding proposals to various outside governments. This is a haphazard, high-risk approach to protecting lives and property, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have questions for the Minister later today. Thank you.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this year's International Women's Day comes at a time of heightened interest in the role of women in politics. This interest started at the time of the last presidential election in the United States, when the most qualified candidate ever to run didn't win. It has continued to the present day, when Cabinet Minister resignations in Ottawa have highlighted the highs and lows of political life for women. None of this has gone unnoticed by the women of the Northwest Territories. The Special Committee on Increasing the Representation of Women in our own Legislative Assembly has had great turnouts at its community hearings. Women want to know how they can take their place in this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, there is a pool of women in the Northwest Territories who are eligible, qualified, and willing to run. Meeting the eligibility is simple. Women need to be 18 years old, a Canadian citizen, and a resident of the Northwest Territories for a year. They are qualified to run by virtue of their life experience. "Just come as you are, ladies," said a friend of mine recently elected to the Yellowknife City Council. None of us came here knowing everything we needed to know to do this job. But since women worry about whether they are qualified, it's worth mentioning that women in the Northwest Territories graduate from high school in greater numbers than men and are more likely to have a university degree. For most women in the Northwest Territories, the biggest consideration is being willing to run. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about why it's worth running. I ran after many years as an advocate for housing and women's issues. I wanted to talk about those issues in this House and push for change. Research says other women often run for the same reasons. They are advocates and they want to pursue those policy issues that are important to women, issues that aren't being discussed as often or even at all by men. That doesn't mean that women can't or won't talk about economic development, financial policy, or land management. Of course they can, but their male colleagues are less likely to talk about pay equity, universal access to family planning, or violence against women. Mr. Speaker, this is where women's voices can make a difference, and the more, the better. Research indicates elected women promote gender equality and strengthen democratic institutions because women are often willing collaborators. Women also make substantive contributions to the consideration of government spending and population health. In short, women can change the world, not only for women, but for everyone. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member statements like in that Sadzasu, the neck carrion, the Amik anyone. What do you get anyone? Member Yellowknife Centre, Sadzanogi, on that member statements. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, women have a right to be in this chamber, whatever their priorities. They have a job to do shaping policy and making change. But perhaps most important, by being here, they show other women what's possible. If you can see it, you can be it. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in a gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure today to recognize Arlene Hache, who is a constituent of Yellowknife North, who is also a very well-known and very well-recognized advocate for social advocate, and especially for women. And I just want to welcome you here and say thank you for being here on this International Women's Day.
Merci. Hatunga Zaguyan de Giki Hudzami, good Danny, member Range Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I'm also pleased to recognize the attendance of the board of the N.W.T. Status of Women Council and their executive director here in the House today. Ms. Violet Kamsel, Blondin, our president, Rita Airy, vice president, Board members Catherine Mackenzie-Taylor, Andrea Steed, and Arlene Hache, as well as the Executive Director, Louise Elder. I'd also like to thank them for their ongoing contributions to improving the lives of women in all our communities, and for being here today, along with the other women in the gallery, to help celebrate International Women's Day. Your presence is very much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I too would like to recognize my friend Violet Kamsel-Blondin. I've had the pleasure of working with Violet for probably 30 years, and she now serves as the chair of the Status of Women Council, and I thank her for her public service. I'd also like to recognize Frame Lake constituent Louise Elder and thank her for her work as Executive Director of the Status of Women Council. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I recognized a couple of pages that we had from Inuvik Twin Lakes. Today I'd like to recognize their chaperone, Blair Connolly, brought them down. Welcome to the Assembly. I'd also like to take a minute to recognize Rita Furlong-Airy from McClavic, who I affectionately call Rita B. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize the lady leaders of the N.W.T Native Women's Association in the gallery, and also Kathy Mackenzie-Taylor from Delaney, and Rita Airy from McClavic, and my CA, Corinne Ferdinand. Merci.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize a Thabacha constituent, Andrea Steed.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize a couple of the pages for Hay River North who've been helping us out through some of these long nights. Ms. Taylor Giovanetti and Ms. Lizzie Reimer. They've been with us all week, and I really appreciate their assistance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too would like to recognize Rita Airy from McClavic, my constituent, and also Vice President of the Status of Women, also a retired social worker after many years of service. We thank you for that and all the work that you do. Merci.
Merci. Member YELLOWKNIFE South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize 3 pages from Yellowknife South: Tyson Lafond, Janica Leah Silverio, and Riley Stanley. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize Ms. Violet Kamsel-Blondin. We've run into each other in a lot of Indigenous events and organized working groups around the territory. Appreciate the work that you do, and also to our friend Arlene Hache. Welcome to the legislature. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we're missing anyone in gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Merci. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. The federal government has introduced Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. The purpose of the Act is to acknowledge that Indigenous governments have the right to create their own laws to regulate child and family services. I realize this legislation was introduced only a week ago, but can the Minister tell us how Bill C-92 will apply in the N.W.T, if at all? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the department's had the legislation for about a week, and we've been going through it and trying to determine how it will impact here in the Northwest Territories, and I think there's still more work that needs to be done on that analysis. However, our early analysis, or through our early analysis, it's not expected that the proposed legislation will significantly impact how CFS is currently delivered here in the Northwest Territories. And it's important to note that the key principles in their legislation remain generally consistent with the principles set out in our N.W.T Child and Family Services Act, as well as building stronger families. As the member said, the purpose of the proposed legislation is to affirm the rights and jurisdictions of Indigenous peoples in relation to child and family services, and sets out some principles applicable at a national level to the provision of child and family services to Indigenous children. And I'd like to note that the Government of the Northwest Territories, both before this legislation and after this legislation passes in Ottawa, has been and will continue to be in support of Indigenous governments exercising jurisdiction in the area of child and family services when they choose. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakeda, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it seems that the reserves in the Northwest Territory and the Clecho Community Services Agency may be the most likely entities to want to implement this bill. Does the government plan to provide any particular help to these organizations or Indigenous governments in order to put themselves into a position to implement this act if passed? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, currently there is two different Indigenous governments that actually have the power and the authority to draw down child and family services today. And we're working with all of our Indigenous partners, and if these Indigenous governments choose to draw down those authorities now, we will certainly work with them in cooperation with Canada to ensure that those services are drawn down and devolved in a way that gives them the ability to provide high-quality services for all their residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wonder what this legislation might do to federal transfers for health to the N.W.T. Would transfers to specific Indigenous governments go via the GNWT, or would they go directly to the Indigenous governments? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honestly, we can't answer that question yet. One of the issues that has been raised at a national level about this legislation is that there are no dollars tied to it. And if dollars come in phase 2, and I believe that's where the federal government said money might come, we'd be happy to work with them, with our Indigenous partners. Bottom line is we all want the same thing, which is fewer Indigenous children in care, and we want to build and support stronger families. And I think we're all trying to do the same thing, and we're prepared to work together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the responses from the Minister. It's my understanding that the bill allows Indigenous governments to negotiate coordination agreements with provincial and territorial governments, as well as Ottawa. Is this an approach GNWT will work with if the bill becomes law? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our current legislation requires us to work with the Indigenous governments and Indigenous communities here in the Northwest Territories if a child from their community were facing apprehension. We're committed to continuing to do that. If the Indigenous governments choose to draw down these responsibilities, of course, we want to work with them and with the Ottawa to make sure that those responsibilities are transferred effectively. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we want the same thing. We want a system that supports families to stay together where it's appropriate and where children have to be apprehended. We want to make sure that it's done in such a way as to maintain connections with culture, community, and residents. So we all want the same thing, Mr. Speaker. We're prepared to work together with all of our partners to make it a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recently read the 2017-2018 ITI grant and contribution report, and I was happy to read that $17.6 million were applied to more than 500 individuals, entrepreneurs, businesses, and groups with an economic interest in our territories. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Infrastructure, Tourism and Industry explain how they report on the use of these funds? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. ITI supports the economy in a bunch of different ways, and the grants and contributions document is a testament to that. It's a roll-up of various ways that we invest in industry, businesses, and entrepreneurs across the Northwest Territories. With that said, we also have appropriate but different ways of reporting out of each of these funding areas. We presently have various accounting spending in this House. I've tabled the BDIC report in this House, Community Futures Investments in Northwest Territories Tourism Marketing Plan, and staff and myself regularly get out and talk to the chambers across the territory and be able to talk about some of these documents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question la Kidade, Cassie member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister verify if these individuals, entrepreneurs, businesses, and groups need to apply yearly, or can they get multi-year funding through this program? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the most part, applicants to the ITI programming, like the support for entrepreneurs and economic development policy, do have to generally apply each year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade, Cassie member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I noticed on page 4, Table 2, contributions by clients exceeding $100,000. The N.W.T. and Nunavut Chamber of Mines received $190,600, and on page 8, the table contribution funding by major program activities for 2018. There is $100,000 for Aboriginal Development Program and $90,600 for the N.W.T. Chambers of Mine. Can the Minister advise if these funds are the same funding? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a fairly detailed question. I don't have the document in front of me, but if I remember right, the document we list by client, by region, by sector, by program area, and so on is in the document. But I think I can confirm that there's two different accountings of the same funding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Cassie member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Ministers giving the answers here today. My final question, Mr. Speaker, is from what I understand, the N.W.T. Chamber of Commerce is responsible for providing funding for Aboriginal Development Support Program. Can the Minister explain why the Department uses a third party, N.W.T. Chambers of Mines, to allocate these funds? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is something I can talk about for hours, is how we're trying to build capacity and participation of Indigenous governments in the mineral resource sector in the Northwest Territories. And one of the ways that we're doing that to help grow our economy and with their participation is through their participation at a number of these industry events that I particularly participate in, the Geoscience, AME Roundup, PDAC. In fact, at PDAC just last week, the Chamber hosted an investment event at PDAC that included presentations and different discussions with Indigenous business leaders and representatives in the mining project sectors across the Northwest Territories with the Chamber of Mines. So this is one of the reasons that we've done this through the Chamber. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a few questions for the Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources. I'd like to ask the Minister, what is the Department doing to make sure communities can implement and fund their wildland fire protection plans? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we know, we have issues with fire around some of our communities, and ENR try to work with the communities to deal with it through, I think, the community access program through MACA. There is some funding there that communities can use if they want to fire smart their communities, as well as during this past fire season was fairly quiet fire season for us, so we actually had some members of our fire crews just to keep working, do some fire smarting around the communities, cut some brush, and so as we're able to, we will assist them. But there are some monies out there. I think through the small community employment fund that comes through the small community fund, small community fund through the small rural and remote committee. There's funding available there too, so if the community wants to do some more fire starting, they have access to some funds, and I think we've greatly enhanced those funds during this session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question like Kidda, the Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it sounded like the Minister came up with another community access fund. That sounds very interesting. I mentioned earlier today that ENR used to fund fire smarting in the N.W.T communities, but has since offloaded the burden onto the communities themselves. Why was this decision made? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I don't think we've offloaded that onto the communities. I think the communities have taken the responsibility for that on, because who knows the communities more than the community, Mr. Speaker. And through the and it's not another pot of money that we have. The Small Community Employment Fund had, I believe it was about $4.2 million, of which $3 million went to a lot of the smaller communities. Through the process that we're going through right now, we've added more money onto that because it's been such an important tool for a lot of the small communities. So they have that opportunity to access that funding, and the communities make the decisions for what's best for their communities, and they have the funds available to bring some of these projects to light. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada de Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, it's good the communities took on this responsibility, but we're talking in a neighborhood of 200,000, for example, to do a community the size of Port McPherson. That's competing with capital projects. What is ENR's estimate of the cost to cut fire breaks around the 3 communities in the Mackenzie Delta? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the exact cost I'm not sure, but a $200,000 investment you would think would save significant dollars if there's damage to the community as a result of the fire. I know that we're in negotiations with Canada on the disaster mitigation funding. That would be another pot of money that communities would be able to access to help with disaster mitigation. So we feel that there is significant investment in this particular area. Again, so we leave the authority to make these type of decisions up to the communities, and you find that communities do make good decisions. And where there's opportunities, as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, with some of our crews that are thankfully we had a quiet fire season, they're able to assist in this as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, seeing as how the Minister is also the money man in the House, fire smarting can save lives and very valuable property, and the cost of doing it is a lot less than many projects our government routinely delivers. Will the Minister identify funds communities can use to implement their wildland fire protection plans by cost sharing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm the Environment Minister, so I will speak with the Finance Minister and see if there's opportunities to access more money. But again, through a number of the programs we have, such as disaster mitigation, there's funds that we'll be able to access to assist with the communities. And the communities, again, have those funds at their disposal if they chose to use them to do some fire smarting. And with folks that we have because of a quiet fire season, assisting them. And so there's a number of opportunities there. Small Community Employment Fund, I believe in one community they did a lot of fire smarting, and they did a lot of cutting of dead brush around their community, and that's a good thing. So I mean, anything, we recognize the importance of saving lives, and I think the communities do as well. So if we can work in cooperation with communities, try to assist them wherever we can to fire smart their communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral questions. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some questions for the Finance Minister that I'm just going to spring on him. I didn't give him any heads up. There's been a lot of announcements about funding to examine some of these big projects that the territory is looking at, whether it's the Slave Geological Province Road or it's Telson Hydro. And you know, it's a lot of federal money, but we're also putting our money into it as well. And so when there's these talks and when these announcements are made, is there any sort of commitment on the part of the feds that in addition to giving us the exploratory money, they're going to be paying for major parts of these potential projects? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're always prepared when there's opportunities for funding from the federal government. One of the things that I've told this House in the last 3 years is a lot of the potential savings we had, so we can match money, federal government money becomes available. A lot of the work that the member's talking about, it's building a case for these potential projects. So normally there's exploratory building a case to try and access the bigger pots of money. When the bigger pots of money are accessed, then I feel that this government is in a very good position to do our cost share of the project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, the Kidade, Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate that answer, and I know that you know, the feds aren't going to come out right and say that they commit right at the beginning here, but I'm a little concerned because, you know, as we're going through this budget here, our last budget, I see what the debt limit is. I see where we're at, and we're pretty much maxed out. And it was about a month ago in this House, the minister said he was going to, he had initiated some talks with the federal finance minister about increasing our borrowing limit and possibly talking about territorial formula financing. And I know that, you know, the minister hasn't had any time in the past 6 weeks because we've been here. So I know he hasn't met with the federal finance minister, but have we set a date for these talks to begin so we can really get into the meat of the issue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have, as I said, initiated talks with them. We've not been able to sit down yet. We've been in session for a while now. But our next finance ministers meeting, I believe, is in June. But there might be opportunities for me to have a conversation with the federal finance minister beforehand and see if we can work on. We're fortunate right now that with the borrowing limit that we do have, most of our projects we're able to fit under there. But if there's announcements for bigger projects that might need more of an investment from the government Northwest Territories, then we need to work with Ottawa to increase our borrowing limit. But as we stand right now, I think we're in fairly good shape with the projects that we do have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade, Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm looking forward to the next assembly and assemblies after that, because these are big projects, they're long-term projects. They're not going to even get started in the life of this assembly, and the piggy bank's almost empty. So can we get assurance from the minister that he's going to have those talks with the finance minister in the life of this assembly, so that going into the next assembly, we might have the money to complete some of these projects, because we're spending territorial funds in addition to the federal funds exploring these projects, but if they're never going to get off the ground, we're just wasting our money. So can we get a commitment that those talks will happen and we should see some results this assembly? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I said I was going to have discussions with the federal government. I was going to have meetings with the federal minister. I'm a man of my word, and I will initiate those discussions. I think with the work that we've done in the last 3 years of the Assembly with some of the corrections we've made on the budget, I think we've positioned ourselves very well to be able to match that. And I take the member's point. And as I said a number of times, a lot of the work that we do here is setting the table for those coming after us. So they'll be in a position, if there's bigger announcements to be made, they'll be in a good position to take advantage of that with our matching dollars and if there's discussion that needs. But I will and I have said I will initiate those discussions, have those discussions with the Federal Finance Minister before the end of this Assembly. Thank you, Mr.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, we set the table, then we ate all the food. There's going to be nothing left for the next Assembly. So just so we know what's going on, would the Minister be able to provide us with a list of projections, cost projections for these future projects over the next 5 or 10 years, just so we have an idea, so that when people are considering entering politics next year, they know what they're in for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, most departments have 20-year infrastructure acquisition plans, and as money becomes available, they're able to put those plans into to do the actual building. If members, there's members that are coming in after us, and I think we're going to position them to come to realize that there's some decisions that were made in this Assembly, I think, that made their work a little easier, and we hope it's a little easier. And if they're in a good position to match a lot of the federal projects, I don't know what's coming down. I mean, we've had some of the projects that we've been working on, we've been proposing, we've been working with Ottawa on, and the departments have 20-year infrastructure needs assessment plans. So I think the next government, the 19th Assembly, is going to be well positioned to take advantage of any federal dollars that become available. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cannon, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Last week I made a member statement about the great post-devolution resource giveaway where the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment issued 10 significant discovery licenses that tie up petroleum resources forever without any benefits to N.W.T. residents. The original exploration rights were issued by the federal government. Can the minister tell us whether the federal government made any provision for fees or work requirements in the issuance of those original rights? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The federal government has never charged rental rates on significant discovery licenses. Provided there was a significant discovery declaration in place, the SDL was issued. Among the terms and conditions tied to exploration license, a 25% work bid deposit was paid, and drilling activity was required in order to maintain the license for the full term. Interest holders were also required to pay rentals in the second period of an exploration license as part of a condition to hold exploration license for 9 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Well, it's my understanding that when the federal government issued those original rights, that they made provision for fees to be charged a rental rate. Perhaps the rental rate wasn't specified, but at least it was in there. So why did the minister not include any fees or work requirements in the 10 significant discovery licenses that he issued? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These interests were tied to exploration licenses issued by the federal government prior to devolution. It's been the policy of our government to hold companies doing business here to the terms they negotiated with the federal government. Future SDL rental rates were not stated in the terms and conditions of the original call for bids documents issued by Canada prior to devolution. The N.W.T would have been put in a high-risk litigation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. So I thank the minister for that explanation. It was fear of risk of litigation that so that we now don't get any benefits from these significant discovery licenses. The minister last week said that we should not, quote, set rules without a transparent and open process, end of quote. The minister also said that he will consider charging rental rates under the terms and conditions for future bids in the Northwest Territories when we put out lands for petroleum exploration in the future. Can the minister tell us who was consulted in setting those rates and what they will be? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The topic of rentals and other SDL policy elements such as terms have been discussed with all current interest holders in the Northwest Territories and representatives of the Intergovernmental Council during the development and amendments of the Petroleum Resource Act and Oil and Gas Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. N.W.T. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for confirming that for me. So for a government that says it's open and transparent, consulting only the industry and perhaps Indigenous governments, that's, only consulting industry, I don't think that's a great idea. And I think that's a clear definition of regulatory capture. So can the Minister make public the work requirements and rental rates for future significant discovery licenses and the rationale that he used in setting them? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The proposed amendments that we put forward for the PRA does include a requirement for the Minister to make the text and any significant discovery license publicly available. Future STL rental rates and how STL work will be credited will also be specified in the future call for bid documents. Whether or not we publicly release the rationale for the rates that we might apply is more of a policy decision at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to follow up again with the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. So he talked about two different ways of capturing some benefits from significant discovery licenses. One is in the initial call for bids, and secondly, in the actual issuance of the significant discovery license itself. So in the call for bids, has a decision been made by the Minister on what the rates would be for significant discovery licenses in the future? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the interim, we've laid out some rates that are detailed, and we've shared that information with committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akita Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that explanation. Is the Minister prepared to make that information public? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't see why we can't do that. We can certainly have a conversation with the member, but I will talk with the department, but I don't see why we would not make those rates public if we're going to impose them on industry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I thank the Minister for that commitment. Can the Minister give me an idea as to when he expects to make this information public? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll have to talk to our officials and see when we can get that out there and let the member know. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that commitment again. Can the Minister commit also that when he puts this information out that he's prepared to accept public comments on it? Because he's already made up his mind perhaps about this without any public input. But I would like to know whether he's prepared to accept public comment when he puts this information out. Thanks, Mr. Chair. And this is about having an open and transparent government and not just consulting with industry and setting these kinds of rates. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to make the members' afternoon, seeing it's a Friday. This is an interim measure that we've put in place because we've seen there was a gap in this when post-devolution. The PRA is going to be taken on the road by the member and his committee, and there will be input from the public that they want to have input on this. Everyone in the Northwest Territories can have input on legislation that's going to be put out there amongst consultation with all members of the Northwest Territories, industry and Indigenous governments, and I welcome all comments back on what we want to do around SDLs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents entitled Letter from President and CEO, Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association to Assistant Deputy Minister Justice regarding genetics and insurance dated March 5th, 2019, and follow-up letter for oral question 619-18 in brackets 3, National Energy Board Regulatory Authority in the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Thabetcha, that Bill 44, Forest Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. The motion's in order. Motion's non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 44 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River South, that Bill 45, Corrections Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motion's in order. Motion's non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 45 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Act, be read for the second time. The bill amends the Petroleum Products Tax Act to impose a carbon tax on petroleum products and natural gas. It makes the amendments necessary for collection and administration of this new tax to be handled in the same manner as the current fuel tax. Purchasers are required to pay the tax, and vendors and collectors are required to remit the tax to the Government of Northwest Territories. The bill allows the Minister to provide in regulation for rebates and grants and increases to maximum fees, fines and penalties which may be imposed either as administrative penalties or on summary conviction. Finally, the bill adds provisions for the appeal of an assessment of tax, interest, or administrative penalties under the Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motion's in order. To the principle of the bill. Member for Freem Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I will provide some introductory remarks and then turn to the process used to develop the bill. I'll also provide some comments on the bill and concerns with what is there and what is missing. The recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we are already seeing the consequence of global warming with an increase of 1 degree Celsius in annual mean temperature. There is more extreme weather and diminishing Arctic sea ice, among other changes. The report notes that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, quote, rapid and far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, end of quote. 91 authors and review editors from 40 countries prepared the report with more than 6,000 scientific references cited. This is very serious, and if we wish to save this planet from irreversible damage, we need to act now. The good news is that some of the kinds of actions that would be needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius are already underway around the world, but they need to accelerate. Canada has signed onto the global agreement to better address climate change. A real carbon pricing system for the Northwest Territories can help us in fighting this emergency. We must pursue legislative and policy changes to ensure that climate change leadership and an energy strategy built on renewables that doesn't masquerade as an infrastructure funding demand. The process. The history of carbon pricing during this Assembly has been a convoluted one at best. Cabinet developed 3 separate but related initiatives related to climate change. The first and obviously highest priority for Cabinet was the 2030 energy strategy, which leapfrogged ahead of the other 2 initiatives and even has a costed 3-year action plan where 44% of the greenhouse gas reductions are supposed to come from the $1 billion Tolson hydro expansion. The poor cousin, the Climate Change Strategic Framework, has languished, still has no action plan, and fails to respond to the Auditor General's report to establish the necessary leadership and authority for climate change success. Finally, there is the carbon pricing scheme, which is the subject of this bill and is to be used to fund the N.W.T contributions to the energy strategy. In May and July of 2016, the Premier was in the media opposing a carbon tax. Thank goodness a new government was elected in the Yukon in November 2016, as that seems to have moderated N.W.T messaging around carbon pricing. On December 9, 2016, the First Ministers, including our Premier, announced the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. This would allow Canada to meet its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 30% from 2005 levels by 2030. I appreciate that a lot of effort has been put in by Cabinet to work out the details of an N.W.T carbon pricing system. I just don't agree with their approach. N.W.T put pressure on the federal government to ante up money for its favorite energy mega project, the expansion of Tolson Hydro, for export to unconfirmed southern markets and to other unconfirmed and hypothetical users in the Slave Geological Province. A discussion paper on N.W.T's approach to carbon pricing was finally released on July 2017. Public comment closed on September 15, 2017. The Standing Committee on Government Operations tried unsuccessfully several times to get the Minister of Finance to develop a number of options or scenarios for carbon pricing. He was urged to consider creating a competitive fund for large emitters to reduce emissions, larger investments into renewable energy that would further reduce the cost of living and greenhouse gas emissions, and other ideas. The Minister refused to respond in any serious way to committee requests. Almost a year after the release of the discussion paper, the Minister of Finance released Cabinet's final approach to carbon pricing on July 11, 2018. A summary of the public engagement on the discussion paper was released at the same time, and a federal report on the impact of carbon pricing on the Northwest Territories that had been completed 5 months earlier was also released to the public. No further comments were invited, and there has been no further public information or engagement since Cabinet's release on July 11, 2018. This government has been dragged to carbon pricing by the federal promise to impose a regime, even if we don't create our own regime. I'd like to, Mr. Speaker, move on to the merits of the bill. I've spoken before in this House about Cabinet's approach to carbon pricing, which is what this bill will implement. Individuals and families will get some of the carbon tax back through adjustments to the cost of living allowance. The largest industrial emitters of greenhouse gas emissions will actually get all of the carbon tax back that they pay. It will be individuals, families, and small businesses that will subsidize the N.W.T initiatives under the energy strategy, not the largest emitters, which are the diamond mines. This hardly seems fair or balanced. A large part of the carbon tax revenues will also be used to fund N.W.T's contribution to the Tolson Hydro expansion, which I have also spoken against in this House. I have no problem and encourage the use of Tolson power to develop the regional economy on the south side of the lake, and I'm glad to get the support of my friends as I speak. But to build millions of dollars worth of transmission lines to unconfirmed markets is risky and likely to cost a lot more than original estimates. This is what happened with Muskrat Falls, Site C, Manitoba Hydro's Keesack Dam, and many other projects. Let there be no mistake, Mr. Speaker, Tolson expansion will take money away from other needs and opportunities, especially small community energy self-sufficiency. I would like to turn to some of the problem areas with the bill. There is a precise regime and schedule for the carbon tax on various fuels. There is no separation of diesel fuel use between motive and non-motive use, as was the case in the July 2017 discussion paper. Butane was also not included in that discussion paper for carbon pricing, but now has a carbon tax rate specified in the bill. While there is some clarity on the carbon tax to be charged and collected, there is no certainty regarding rebates, which are to be prescribed in future regulations at the total discretion of the Minister. The Minister will also have total discretion to prescribe who will be defined as a large emitter, and the Minister will have unfettered authority to determine grants to be given to such large emitters. It seems to me that there should be some bounds on the minister's discretion in these matters. Lastly, there is no requirement for any public reporting of revenues raised through the proposed carbon tax, rebates, or grants that the minister may hand out, or even administrative costs associated with the implementation of the carbon tax. Given the concerns that the public and regular MLAs have raised about a carbon tax, its impact on the cost of living, and how it may or may not contribute to greenhouse gas reductions, it is rather astounding that there is so little accountability and transparency around the revenues to be raised, their use, and impacts. I've consistently raised the need for an integrated approach to monitoring and public reporting of energy self-sufficiency, climate change, greenhouse gas reductions, carbon pricing, and the impacts on the cost of living, and this bill does not address that. I still believe that carbon pricing is an essential tool in fighting climate change. However, the minister has clearly been dragged to this measure and has shown very little interest in working with regular MLAs or the public in exploring different options or scenarios to develop the best approach for the Northwest Territories and our residents with regard to a carbon tax. In my view, Cabinet's approach is unfair, the unfettered ministerial authority over grants to large emitters and rebates, an energy strategy focused on a huge mega project, lack of progress on climate change leadership, and no commitment to integrated climate change monitoring and public reporting, I cannot support the bill as drafted. I look forward to participating in the proceedings of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to hear what the public and interested stakeholders have to say about a carbon tax in the Northwest Territories and whether they think this is fair approach from Cabinet and whether it will really lead to progress on climate change. Mussy, Mr. Speaker.
Mussy. To the principle of the bill, member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is my view on what this bill enables. First, I want to acknowledge that the views and concerns people have shared with me I consider very much valid and important, and their opinions are not lost on me. Bear with me as I share with you two perspectives on the carbon tax effectiveness and another that describes what we are doing here in the North. Let me start with carbon tax. When originally proposed, I agreed that a carbon tax as a concept had the potential to be an effective way of achieving the long-term goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But since its introduction by the federal government and the ongoing campaign conducted by its proponents, as well as politicians, including here in the N.W.T, has allowed it to become so politicized and tainted that it is no longer politically reasonable. And in the meantime, rising oil prices continue to reduce the carbon tax's socio-economic business case. And while I agree that we need to shift our habits and behaviors, the fact is that within our current limited technological means, in order to achieve the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions enough to meet the Paris Agreement, it would require carbon taxes so high that they are a political non-starter. And I am not the only one that has this view. Many proponents of carbon tax seem to agree with me on this. And many proponents in the North also agree with me that the Made in the North version of carbon tax will do little to nothing towards changing Northerners' behaviors, much less meet set targets for carbon emission reduction. As I stated in previous member statements, current models of carbon taxes are not a serious proposal to curb emissions. Rather, in my view, it is a flailing attempt to alleviate government's conscience with a symbolic gesture toward mitigating the impacts of climate change. As we see across the country, many provincial governments now exiting the program, there's a fading interest in carbon tax, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for the environment. Why? Because even without a meaningful carbon tax, fuel prices across the country are reaching all-time highs at the pump. Again, I noted in a previous statement that fuel was at $1.13 a litre just a few years back, and now it's been as high here in Yellowknife as $1.50. The federal government has never clarified how the carbon tax would interact with changing oil prices. Yes, low prices made a carbon tax seem somewhat acceptable, but with high oil prices, it makes it seem punishing to the average northern family already struggling with higher fuel costs. So what can we implement that already has a proven means of effectiveness and can have immediate impact on reducing greenhouse gases? Well, let's remember that the use of a carbon tax is relatively new and is directed at shifting behavior. Significant progress has been made in the past by using other tools, in particular the use of legislation, regulation, and policy, rather than behavioral taxes. For example, mandatory mileage standards for vehicles have resulted in dramatic increases in fuel efficiency, allowing people to drive more energy-efficient vehicles without guzzling more gas. Electricity generation has been mostly decarbonized in Canada, not so much in the Northwest Territories, through government subsidies and/or appropriations. In some jurisdictions, there has been a major shift to natural gas rather than burning oil or coal. In other jurisdictions, there is significant move toward hydro rather than diesel. So taxing behavioral change seems less important in those regions, especially given that it's industry that is making the commitments to these changes and that they are the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions after all. Now, the second point is regarding what are we dealing with here in the North. I have and continue to take this position since being elected, and that is, we are faced with many challenges in the North, but at the forefront is their ability to afford living here and doing business here. If we can't find ways to do either at a standard and comfort level that we have come to know and expect, then frankly, those who can will begin to depart and leave the North so they can have those standards and comforts met elsewhere. That said, I believe that individuals are making smarter choices these days with regard to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by implementing efficiencies and taking responsible actions in their day-to-day lives. Many families and homeowners are replacing windows, re-insulating ceilings and walls, installing pellet stoves and boilers, putting up solar panels, and doing simple things like changing to LED bulbs and putting timers on lights and outlets. Proof of this is that Arctic Energy Alliance's energy rebate programs are oversubscribed year over year, and that's a good thing. We've noticed that, so has the federal government, and we've increased Arctic Energy's Alliance pot by nearly double over the next 4 years. As the technology becomes more practical and affordable in the North, communities will implement better energy systems, just like Colville Lake's solar panel system, and soon to be Inuvik wind farm. I also believe that business and industry are making responsible energy efficiency improvements and are also motivated to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels because they too believe in being environmentally responsible, but also because it affects their bottom line profits. A good example again is the Diavik wind farm. I understand that investment reduced Diavik's fuel consumption by nearly 15%. I also feel governments are doing good things with regard to meeting their goals for reducing emissions. And collectively, they are one of the highest emitters in the territory and would be exempt from the carbon tax. Both the City of Yellowknife and the N.W.T have made significant investments in transferring over to biomass and developing and using district energy and co-energy for heating and powering their own assets and facilities. What's more, the savings and return on investment from those initiatives are now allowing these respective governments to self-fund these projects rather than further burden taxpayers with increased taxes to pay for these improvements. In addition, I touched on this above. Long before any carbon tax concepts were being discussed, governments have developed and applied significant laws, regulation, and policy that have been applied to both individuals, businesses, and industry over the last decade or so to create less dependence on fossil fuels, and those regulations are starting to have proof positive effects as well on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So why don't I support a carbon tax? Simple. I've come to realize that a very high carbon tax that would shift people's behavior is not politically doable in the North, and that the Made in the North version is not going to change anyone's behavior. Therefore, we can no longer hang on to this silver bullet or magic wand approach for called a carbon tax. And therefore, I will not be supporting the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. To the principle of the bill. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak to the merits of the government's carbon pricing scheme that will be enabled through the passage of Bill 42. Mr. Speaker, I want to set for the record very clearly that I believe in carbon pricing for Canada. I believe in carbon pricing for the world. A mechanism for carbon, either through market measures or through taxation, are good things. In the December 14, 2018 meetings of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, otherwise known as COP24, they reported that as of April of last year, carbon pricing initiatives implemented or scheduled for implementation were expected to cover 20% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. These are not, and that's representative that things are changing. This is no longer a political initiative of fringe political parties or political actors who are passionate about one issue. This is good economic sense. It's been endorsed by leading economists. It's been endorsed by the World Bank. This is not an alien proposal to how the economy works. In fact, China, which is one of the major issues, one of the major stumbling blocks in ensuring a global response to climate change action through economic measures, has signed on. They are building on some 7 municipal and provincial cap-and-trade markets within the country to what will amount to become the world's largest carbon market. Mr. Speaker, here in Canada, British Columbia has had a successful revenue-neutral carbon pricing regime since 2008, and since implementation they have posted the strongest economic growth in Canada. And it's very clear that in the British Columbia model, they recognize the need to protect economic competitiveness while implementing carbon pricing, and the need for effective collaboration by providing incentives for people to invest, for example, in home energy and zero-emission vehicles. The government has also further committed to all of its government operations will be completely carbon neutral. It's those kind of leadership statements that provincial governments, federal governments, and world governments can take to show that they are committed to protecting and preserving the future of our planet, our environment, and the health of our citizens. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has come out in support of carbon pricing. The Chamber's view is that it's the only effective way to reduce carbon emissions, but it requires collaboration, again, with stakeholders, with businesses, to ensure that the regulatory burden on businesses in our jurisdictions is lessened and is not further increased with a new scheme, and that the revenues are returned to them in the form of incentives to help them lower their costs. The Canadian Mining Association supports carbon pricing, which is a key actor for our economy here in the Northwest Territories. Their president has said the carbon tax is the most effective and efficient means of driving emissions reductions and making real progress in the fight against climate change. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not opposed to carbon taxing. I don't think the world is opposed to carbon taxing. I think the world, or carbon pricing, I think the world has embraced this. And many members in this House have been encouraging this government to be proactive on this, to not wait until the 11th hour to put forward a carbon pricing solution that will allow us to meet our national and international obligations. And yet here we are in the last year of our term with something that has become very controversial, and something that members have on this side of the House has just spoken against. And I think that's because this bill did not go through the same level of collaboration and partnership that we've seen on other pieces of legislation. The Standing Committee on Government Operations has been working on carbon pricing for quite some time now. I think my honourable friend from the member for Frame Lake, put this very clearly, that our efforts to collaborate, to propose new ideas and solutions have fallen on deaf ears. And I have come to believe that the Honourable Minister of Finance would simply prefer this issue to go away. Perhaps the provincial governments who are opposing this in court will be successful, and we can drop it if a new federal government comes in place. These are not leadership. The Auditor General of Canada, those beliefs, and I think that you can demonstrate that can be backed up with action statements, words, and a lack of action behind the scenes here at the committee level and in the business planning stages, that there isn't clear leadership coming from this government on this very important issue to the economic health and well-being of Northerners, and to our goals to preserve and protect our environment and the health of our citizens. The Auditor General report on climate change revealed a serious lack of leadership on N.W.T actions to fight climate change. The Standing again, in committee, worked collaboratively and provided clear and concise recommendations on how that can improve. None of those recommendations have been fully implemented. The most important ones around leadership, about giving a very clear message as a whole of government approach that's binding on other departments, so there's a very clear sense in the public and within the bureaucracy that this is a top priority, and we need to continue to work on it. I agree that adaptation needs to be our priority, but the global economy is adapting to carbon pricing, and we need to be a part of that if we're going to protect our businesses and protect our industries. Mr. Speaker, this bill places the burden of the pricing scheme through a carbon tax onto the pocketbooks of Northerners and small businesses, while carving out extensive breaks for large emitters that are responsible for nearly 50% of total emissions. The tax applied to large industry are largely returned by the rebates, and the funds that are held by government can be accessed by those same emitters in personalized funds, rather than building a globally competitive fund that all emitters can compete for resources so they can help as an incentive to help bring clean growth solutions to their industrial operations. The vital rebate programs in this bill, which are the crux of any successful pricing regime, are governed solely through regulation, which means that this House will lack the necessary oversight tools to affect these programs and cements total control in the hands of the minister. And while this would not be such a major issue for me, the current minister again has demonstrated has not demonstrated a willingness to collaborate with regular members and members of the public and members of industry on building a regime that works for everyone. This House cannot speak for future governments and the ministers of those governments, but I think we must ensure that it is the House and its members who decide these issues, such as the rebates and other important issues of climate change public policy, and those powers and discretion are not solely in the hands of the minister and government bureaucracy. The people need to be able to speak through their representatives on these issues. And Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that we need to do a better job on building a scheme that works. I have implored the government to look at other options. Again, I refer to the Chinese model where they've moved to a cap-and-trade system. We didn't even consider that. At the time, the province of Ontario had a very successful, and Quebec had a very successful cap-and-trade program in partnership with California. There are no reasons we couldn't have collaborated with Yukon and Nunavut to build a northern carbon market and to keep the burden on industry and off of everyday Northerners, and to find more competitive ways to incentivize clean growth solutions to business. The Tulsan program expansion is something I do in fact support. I think it's a key component of building the economy of the North. But again, it's very far off, and for this government to pin 33% of its reductions on something that is a policy proposal that has pennies for the big picture invested in it currently. We cannot afford to pin all of our hopes on that. We need to have a better mechanism, and the mechanism that's being proposed today, again, it puts the burden onto the pocketbooks of Northerners in such a way that I cannot support. And I hope that we are able to improve the bill if it does go forward, but at this time I encourage all honourable members of this House to carefully consider what is being proposed, the lack of collaboration, the lack of consultation, and whether or not the proposed federal backstop that Yukon and Nunavut are both agreeing to implement in their jurisdictions, that now that we know the details of that, is a more generous rebate for individuals, and individual Northerners will receive more from the federal backstop than they will from this carbon pricing scheme. I think we must carefully consider if this is the direction we want to go, if this is the direction we want to bind future governments for, or if we should leave the administrative burden of the new tax in the hands of the federal government that this minister has said is imposing this tax on the people of the North. Let them impose it them. Let them give a more generous rebate, and let's work with our partners to build a more robust carbon pricing system that targets the people who are actually causing the emissions, and that ensures we can keep the cost of living as low as possible in the Northwest Territories. It's possible to get carbon pricing right, but this bill gets it wrong, and I encourage members to vote against it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, to the principle of the bill, member for South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the principle of the Bill 42, we have been placed in our seats here by the members of our respective riding and the community as a whole in subjects such as sensitive as this one to increase a increase a revenue stream to make efforts in reducing our gas emissions. As my colleague from the Cam Lake riding had mentioned, this is really a global community one to address the targets set in the Paris Accord. And I keep an open mindset. I will and look forward to engaging the community consultation process after the second reading of this bill to give the people a chance to voice their concerns to the bill aside from our own. And keeping an open mind, I will not take that privilege away from the people that put me in this position, in the SA2, for example. I've mentioned in previous discussions and presentation, take the average young or old or middle-aged trapper downtown Colville Lake. How would they be impacted to this additional tax, putting the gas in their snow machine to go harvest income in fur-bearing animals? So I'm willing to give that individual a chance to speak to the bill, give the proper documentation to the communities, let them, in collaboration with this government, make a decision that we think is fair to everyone in creating revenues for offsetting cost reductions for the consumption of, say, home diesel fuel, for example, or non-motive or motive, in purchasing energy-efficient appliances. We really live in a high-cost, and I think everybody would agree, we live in a high-cost part of Canada. We have a formula that is set, a fixed income, and we're trying to broaden our benefits based on a set income. We've said all along in the Premier's sessional statements, a number of times, 32% of the revenues is contributed by industry. So we got to be mindful of industry's presence here, and I was very encouraged to hear industry thinking and stating this is a good tax in the reducing of gas emissions into our atmosphere. So it really is a pan-territorial initiative. I'm willing to and support going on the road with this bill and give the people the proper information so they can make informed decisions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. To the principle of the bill, member for Trinity-Willity.
Mr. Speaker, I cannot support anything that would increase the cost of living for the people of the small communities. The people I represent are natural people that go out and they hunt, and that's how they supplement their income. As everyone knows, we have very low incomes in the small communities, and when an elder asks a young hunter to go hunting for them, their responsibility is to pay for the gas, and then the young person does all the work, goes out in the land, and the further away the caribou is moving, the more costly it gets for the gas, for the young person to go hunting. And even if there's a tax rebate attached to the gas, or just a tax rebate inside the Income Tax Act, it's still going to cost money at the time the person needs to go hunting. It's not going to be that sometime after income tax season, the individuals get a rebate, and that becomes something that can be then turned into the gas they had already paid extra for to go hunting. And so for me, I'm thinking about what would my community want? Do they want to, tomorrow, when they pour gas into their vehicle, gas into their machines, snowmobiles and whatnot, do they want, at that point, do they want to pay extra because they might get a rebate, or they will get a rebate sometime during the income tax season? When you're hungry now, you can't wait for income tax season to buy the food that you need. What they need to do is to not pay the extra as a tax on the gasoline, and they need to be, I mean, the cost of gasoline is high enough. Sometimes the elders have just enough money to buy just enough gas to be able to get somebody to hunt for them. And then the hunters do it because they too can hunt for themselves at the same time at the expense of the elders, and the elders do it because it's a lot more efficient for them to have caribou meat, moose meat, whatever it is that they're hunting for, muskox. It could be a variety of things. And in the communities I represent, all 4 communities rely on caribou. And the fact that there is a reduction in the numbers with the caribou, and the caribou have seemed to either have disappeared or moved further east. A lot of the people and the elders say, yeah, a lot of the caribou have moved east or have joined other herds, and it's become more difficult for them to access caribou. And then on top of that, to tell them that they'll have to pay extra at the pumps. And I'm saying, you know, it doesn't matter to them whether they get a rebate sometime in the future. That'll go to something else. That cost will be consumed by something, that rebate will be consumed by something else. Also, the premise that the major reduction of greenhouse gas is going to be based on a Tulsan project. And I spoke against an expansion of Tulsan here. Although I will most likely vote in favor of money that's going to be handed out to the territorial government from the federal government to consult with the people that are impacted by Tulsan. I still think there's a lot to be settled there. You know, I mean, the Tulsan Dam wiped out a whole community. It wiped out 2 communities, actually. Very little said about a place called Rat River, which had a few people that generally had family in Russia River, that other community that was completely wiped out. You know, you hear about the elders that talk about there are so many muskrat on the shores, it looks like there's a hill sitting there, and I think an elder told me the other day that there are so many muskrats swimming down Tulsan River, he thought it was a raft. You know, and that was wiped out completely. And it happened a couple of years ago too, by the release of water during wintertime. When you release water in the wintertime, although NCPC said there was no release of water, I don't think naturally they flood the river. I don't think Mother Nature would kill all its animals on a river by itself. I think it is man that has done that. And I think that has to be settled too. If we're going to put together a strategy that bases itself on Tulsan River expansion, and that's how we're going to reduce our greenhouse gases, and that's our contribution, then we should settle with the people from Russia River. We should settle with the people that were wiped out, forced to relocate, lost their way of living, became a lost society. I think that has to happen. But bottom line is, for today, the most important thing is the increased cost in gas. And for today, to have the elders put more cost on the elders. That's what will happen. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter what the Income Tax Act is going to say at the end when we make those adjustments. It's the cost today that's important. Thank you, Mrs. Speaker.
Merci. To the principle of the bill, member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't think any of us here would like to see a carbon tax implemented in our territory, as we have the highest cost of living in this country alone. Mr. Speaker, I know that some of the members aren't supporting this, but I, like my member from the South too, I'd like to see this proceed. This initiative, the federal government actually, I believe, sees that the territories has a small footprint on the carbon in our country, and they're willing to work with us. And what's being presented is a far better deal than what will actually be imposed on us if we don't support this. And the bottom line is what is the best deal for my riding is what I'll support, and this by far will be a less impact on the cost of living in my riding. My constituents are paying in the neighborhood of $1.92 per liter. We can't afford, even 5 cents makes a big difference, and that's what we're talking. Will be a cost of living offset, and I think that would be a less impact on my residents in the Mackenzie Delta and for all people of the Northwest Territories. So, we'll let this proceed and get all the information that's actually to this and make the right decision when it comes to third reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. To the principle of the bill, member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we've heard everybody here talk about it, and I appreciate the government of the Northwest Territories. They've reached out to the federal government to, work on a deal for heating fuel, and so it's not going to have an impact. But we're still going to have an impact on it because we're going to have to pay for the transportation costs here. I'm not going to reiterate everything. Here's what's the cost of living. I've listened to my communities, and they've heard the concerns about gas, and it is an issue. We don't have to go on a road trip to hear it. We've heard it in the House here. We've heard it in member statements. We've heard it, ministers have heard it through our correspondence with them. It's going to be an impact on cost of living. So right now, if the way we have it right now, I cannot support this. It's about the small communities. It's about the people there. It's about the people that we're supposed to be representing. And so right now, I cannot support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. To the principle of the bill, member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like my colleagues from the Mackenzie Delta and the Sawtooth, my region, we're very rich in natural gas resources, and we've yet to develop that. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, in the future of the territory, that the Univale will come to that. And Mr. Speaker, the cost of living is the highest in my region and territory. Also, the cost of transportation, and to see aviation fuel being exempt from things like that as well. And I think to bring down the cost of living as well, Mr. Speaker, consultation is very important, especially with Indigenous groups. When we look at the amount of bills, there's a huge amount of bills that are going through this legislature and this assembly. I think what we need to keep in mind is we need to continue with growing capacity within this legislature to bring those forward, so that our members are informed and we're able to make educated decisions. Sometimes I sit here and I see some of the decisions that we make on both sides. Sometimes from where I sit, they seem uninformed, but maybe there's something that I'm missing as well too. But Mr. Speaker, I would like to see this go forward, and I would like to encourage the government of Northwest Territories to involve the Inuvialuit and all the other Indigenous groups across the territory, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Masi. To the principle of the bill, member for Dehcho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the principle of the bill, and namely because here in the Northwest Territories we live in a vast and remote part of Canada, and of course the cost of living is very high. And recently in the media, it was brought to the public's attention that our income support, the cost of income support is increasing, with more of our people depending on supplements from this government to put food on our table. So how could we, rationalize adding more of a burden on the average people in the average communities of the North? It just boggles me. So for those reasons, I will not support it. Merci.
Merci. To the principal of the bill, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government is opposed to any kind of tax. But this is one that the federal government, in their infinite wisdom, has decided they were going to implement, regardless. So our challenge was to try to mitigate the impact that it was going to have on people across the Northwest Territories. Our folks at the department went across the Northwest Territories, they listened to people, they understood that a tax was coming, they didn't like it. Nobody is opposed to a new tax. Everybody's opposed to a new tax. That's why this government has, in our 4 years, did very little as far as raising taxes in the Northwest Territories. And people have said that they want the least impact on themselves as possible. Now, I am sure members of opposite have heard those concerns. And it's always good to stand up and say, well, I'm opposed to a new tax. Well, I'm opposed to a tax as well. The federal government is going to implement it. There's been a couple of challenges. We'll have to wait to see. What this does, this gives us the tools we have to try and work to mitigate. I've provided some information to members opposite, some briefings that we've had, on the cost to people in the Northwest Territories had we used the federal backstop. Federal backstop, should have gotten printed bigger. Federal backstop, $922.59 cost on the average family. N.W.T approach to carbon pricing, $356.92. That's a $753 difference. So you want to tell the people of the Northwest Territories that, yes, we like the federal backstop so much, it's going to cost you $700 more a year, but we're going to go with that. Is that what you're telling them? Or, as a couple of members so wisely said, why don't you take it on the road? Let them tell you that themselves and see what they say. We claim to hear the voice of the people in the Northwest Territories sometimes, and there's times we can't over the sound of our own voices. So let's not decide what's best for them. Let's give them an opportunity to decide for themselves. I think we've worked very close. We've showed a lot of leadership on this. We've had other jurisdictions actually wanting to use our approach because they think it's one that's a little fair to them. Aviation fuel, we worked with the federal government. They exempted that. Great. Heating fuels, diesel, propane, natural gas. Our approach is zero. Their approach is $435.95. So, I mean, I can understand the members' concern, of course. I mean, I've heard a lot of concerns. We want to do our bit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is all fine. I think that was the overall goal of the Pan-Canadian Framework and the Paris Agreement. But our challenge here in the Northwest Territories is how we're going to mitigate the impact that it's going to have on our folks here. I've given you some numbers. Part of what we're criticized for sometimes is our lack of communication. I have to agree there. I mean, we should have communicated a lot of this information better to the folks out there. Then they can get a hold of you and say, hey, my MLA, that's not too bad. I don't like a tax, but if this is going to mitigate, and we don't know what's going to happen on July 1st. As I said before, there's a couple of challenges that are being taken out there, but I don't want to play catch up. I want to make sure that we're prepared so when it comes that our people are not affected or are not feeling it. And using the federal backstop, it's not good for our people, not at all. Not at all. I've given you the numbers. And again, I think there should be an opportunity for people out there to tell you how they feel about this, recognizing the fact that the federal government, again, in their infinite wisdom, plan to implement this regardless. And what we're trying to do for the people in Northwest Territories is mitigate the impact. Otherwise, it would cost them a lot more. We don't like taxes, but we're trying to do what's best for our people. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, a discussion like this, I think, requires a recorded vote.
To the principle of the bill. Question's been called. There's been a request for a recorded vote. All those in favor, please stand.
Member for Untitled Lakes, member for River South, member for Thatcher, member for Mackenzie Delta, member for Sawtoo, the member for N.W.T, the member for Inuvik-Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South.
All those opposed, please stand.
The member for Hay River North, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada-Welladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Yellowknife for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Center, the member for Decho.
All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 10 in favor, 8 opposed, motion carried. Bill 42 has had a second reading, is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading on bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am opposed. Oh, sorry. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, that Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, be read for the second time. This bill amends the Income Tax Act to make changes to non-refundable tax credit claimed by multi-jurisdictional individual tax filers, including changes that restrict the Northwest Territories pension credit to Northwest Territories residents, and changes that allow full pension and dividend credits to be claimed by Northwest Territories residents with business income earned outside the Territories. This bill also amends the Income Tax Act to provide a cost of living offset as a mechanism for recurring carbon tax revenue to Northwest Territories residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order to the principle of the bill. Member for Frame Lake.
Nice try. Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to be nearly as long on this one. I'm not going to oppose this bill. It does serve a number of public purposes, including allowing for pension credits to be earned by residents and so on. So, and it's simply enabling legislation in terms of allowing for a cost of living credit to be used. So I don't really have anything to oppose in this bill. I wish that there was some stronger public reporting provisions tied back to how this is going to be used to report on rebates that are tied to the carbon tax, but I don't have any difficulty with this bill. Massey, Mr. Speaker.
To the principle of the bill. To the principle of the bill. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 43 has had a second reading, is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading on bills. Second reading on bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Bill 2631, Committee Report 1218.3, 1318.3, Minister Statement 131.18.3, 151.18.3, 158.18.3, and Table Document 237.18.3, and Table Document 322.18.3, with Member Hay River North in the chair.
Now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee would like to consider table document 322-18 brackets 3 main estimates 2019-2020 with the Department of Legislative Assembly. Also committee report 13-18 brackets 3 Standing Committee on Government Operations report on Bill 31 N.W.T. Northwest Territories 911 Act, and Bill 26 Statistics Act, and Bill 31 the N.W.T. 911 Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will consider the documents and bills after a recess. Thank you. I will call Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider table document 322-18(3), looking at the Legislative Assembly, which begins on page 1 of the document. I will turn to the Speaker for opening comments. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as you know, we have entered the final year of the 18th Assembly, and this is the last operation budget from my office prior to the general election and the selection of a new Speaker in the 19th Assembly. It has been a distinct honor and privilege to serve as your Speaker, and I hope I have met your expectation in terms of presiding over your debates in a fair and objective manner. The Legislative Assembly is seeking an operational expenditure appropriation of $22,443,000. This represents an increase of $1,653,000, or a 7.9% increase from 2018-2019 main estimates. Mr. Chair, while this is a significant increase, this additional funding is needed every 4 years in order to conduct the territorial general election 2019 for preparing and moving on to the next assembly. During this time, your Legislative Assembly has worked to improve communication to reach all peoples of Northwest Territories. We have taken steps to bring our proceedings and also the work of the committees to all the regions of Northwest Territories and all of our official languages. I will have more to say on the matter shortly, Mr. Chair. My office has also been working to educate and raise awareness of our system of government and the profile of the Legislative Assembly through the development of 2 educational videos, enhancement of our annual report, the Maize Outreach Program, the Youth Parliament, and improvements to our website, particularly with respect to committee operations. This will include providing funding needed by Elections N.W.T. to undertake the next territorial general election. I would note that the funding being requested by Elections N.W.T. for 2019 general election is the same level of funding that was approved for the last general election held in 2015. My thanks to the Chief Electoral Officer for the proactive measures she is undertaking to improve voter engagement and control costs through innovation. Mr. Chair, we have also begun the important work to increase the representation of women in the Legislative Assembly. A special committee has been struck to examine and provide recommendations on how to achieve this in the years to come. Funding remains in 2019-20 budget to complete this important work, and I look forward to tangible results stemming from the committee's work and the recommendations in the next election. During the last sitting, the House took the important step to enhancing the Ombudsman Act. This budget includes funding for the establishment of this office. It is my hope that you will appoint the Northwest Territories' first Ombudsman during this sitting, and that full act will be ready for implementation by fall of 2019. Colleagues, this summer, in partnership with Commonwealth Parliamentarian Association, I will host the first of its kind in Canada. I have invited Indigenous parliamentarians, members of all Parliament from across Canada, federal, provincial, territorial legislatures, as well as some from other Commonwealth countries, the United States, to meet in Yellowknife this summer on or around National Aboriginal Day 2019. The purpose of this conference will be to explore the unique challenges that Indigenous members of Parliament face when working in what we are essentially colonial institution. The conference will explore the tensions that Indigenous members often experience when attempting to govern in an adversarial environment compared to the more consensus-based style system that they are accustomed to. It will also explore the capability of Indigenous representation in our parliaments with the inherent rights to self-government, and whether and how we should change our public institutions to be more reflective of Indigenous culture and traditions. I invite all members to join me in Yellowknife for this exciting conference this summer around June 2019. We have an excellent lineup of panelists and keynote speakers, and the reception from around Canada and the world has been outstanding so far. Colleagues, earlier this year, the Language Commissioner submitted a report to my office with thoughtful and important recommendations to improve the services we provide to members and the public in all N.W.T official languages. It should be no secret to members that this is an issue that I'm passionate about. Of all the public policy challenges we face as elected members, there are a few that are urgent and as important as the preservation of our languages. Future generations will judge us by the actions we take or fail to take to save these languages, and they're linked to our cultures. We have a closing window of opportunity to act, colleagues. Once our language disappears, they are gone forever. The time has come for bold action from all corners of government and the society to turn the tide and change the path of history. The budget before you for adoption today includes a tripling of Assembly's language budget to not only implement the recommendation of the Languages Commissioner, but go much further. This summer, the Assembly will host a language symposium to develop a common set of parliamentary terms in all of our languages. I am fluent in my language, Clinton language, yet I still rely heavily on the English terms such as bill, point of order, and prorogation. As leaders in this House, we need to set good examples for the rest of the territory in terms of language use. We can talk and talk and talk, but the language revitalization, but until we start walk that talk, nothing will change the current path that we are on. A road or a hospital that does not get built next year can still be built the following year. Not so much to our language. When they are gone for good. I want no part in that legacy. The increase in language funding this year is not the end. It is my hope and commitment that in the years ahead, the Legislative Assembly, our Assembly, will have a fully functioning language bureau to not only support the use of all languages in the written and spoken records of this Assembly, but to live up to the spirit and vision of the Official Languages Act put in place by our predecessors in this House. Our languages should not be nice to have. We should not be satisfied with throwing a token word or two of our Indigenous language in a committee report or a table document. The time has come to stop paying lip service to presentation of our languages and start investing the resources needed to stay their extinction. I have made it my passion and also mission to speak predominantly in my language in this place, in this House, and I encourage the members who are fluent in their languages to do the same. They are equal in the status to French and English if we treat them that way. Colleagues, in closing, I feel obligated to correct the public record with respect to MLA compensation. A recent CBC News article suggested that members of this House are planning to vote themselves a 20% pay increase in the upcoming fiscal year. This is patently false. In an age when the term fake news has become part of our common vocabulary, it is unfortunate and irresponsible that our public broadcasting has been unable to resist the temptation of gotcha journalism and the needless sensationalism. Colleagues, members of this Assembly have not voted themselves a pay increase in 20 years, despite recommendations to do so from independent compensation review committee over the years. The 1920 budget continues to hold this line by budgeting no more than the cost of living increase as provided for in the legislation. The increase in the members' compensation budget for 2019 are related to the transition costs that always come in an election year and are consistent with the recommendation of this and the previous year's independent commissions. Mr. Chair, I will conclude by thanking all members, my colleagues on the Board of Management, the Assembly staff for their contributions and their effort in working towards the efficient operations and delivery of quality services for the Legislative Assembly. This concludes my opening remarks. I am pleased to respond to any questions that members may have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that you have witnesses you wish to bring into the chamber, so I will ask the Sergeant at Arms to escort the witnesses into the House. And Mr. Speaker, you may take a seat at the witness table. Mr. Speaker, please introduce your witnesses for the record.
Mr. Chair, I have with me to my right, Tim Mercer, Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, and to my left, Darren Ouellette, Director of Corporate Services. He's back again. The last time we said it was the last presentation, but he decided to stay with us for another year, so we're thankful of that. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I remember wishing him farewell, and here he is again. Well, welcome back to the witnesses. The total department can be found on page 5 of the document, but as always, we will consider the activities first. There are 5 activities under the Legislative Assembly. The first is expenditures on behalf of members, and this is found on page 9. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, in the expenditure category on page 9, there is an increase of $696,000 in the area of compensation and benefits. And I'm wondering if the Speaker or his staff can provide a breakdown of how that money is allocated. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair, part of the difference is we started paying to members' pension. For the last 20 years, we haven't been paying to members' pension, similar to across Canada. Most or all legislatures pay into members' pension, and we've been fortunate with a great economy over the years. But now, since last year, we started contributing towards that, so that's part of the cost. And also another cost is a transitional allowance for members. Every election, we allocate upwards of 6 individuals, could be either retiring or losing their seats, so we have to subsidize for that. As you know, 2015, we had to turn over 11 new members. So we fell behind on our funding allocation at that time, so we want to be prepared for that. So those are just some of the difference. But however, Mr. Chair, I'll allow our Director of Corporate Services maybe to elaborate more and provide more detailed information. Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, as the Speaker referred to, transitional costs in that are the 2 allowances, the transition allowance and the retraining allowance. We make assumptions that during a transition to the next assembly that there could be up to 6 members that would not be returning for various reasons. That's $432,000 that's been budgeted in that area. There is also the cost of living adjustment for a total of $107,000 in that particular category. And then there's also the allowances that have now become taxable. We've reallocated that budget into the compensation and benefits area, and that was for $157,000.
Thank you. Ms. Green.
Thank you for the information. I want to just ask a further explanation for the taxable benefit. Could the Speaker or his staff provide a little more information about the taxable allowance and its current status? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ouellette.
Okay. Currently, effective January 1st, with the Federal Income Tax Act, the previous non-taxable allowances that members received in the range of $7,600 per year now became taxable, so on January 1st. So that's the status of it. They're taxed now, and members receive the gross tax on a biweekly basis, and at the end of the year they'll get a T4A to provide taxes there. So at the time when we drafted the main estimates, the thinking was that these would be taken from payroll source, and so the budget was reallocated to this area. That thinking has since changed, and so it'll be returned back to the accounts payable, the expenditures category for allowances.
Thank you. Ms. Green.
Thank you for that explanation. And the other thing I wanted to ask is the finance director already mentioned that in 2015 there were 11 changes in the House. The budgeting has been for 6 members. So what's the premise of the 6 members, and what happens if it does turn out to be another large turnover in terms of funding? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we're budgeting in a transition year, we have to make assumptions about how many members will not be returning, and our assumptions have consistently been a turnover of about a third of members in any given election. We always hope it's going to be less than that, but that's what we budget for. And the transition allowance payments that we budget for assume that 2 first-term members will not be returning, that 2 two-term members will not be returning, and that 2 three-term members or 2 ministers will not be returning. So if the turnover tends to be more than 6 members, or if it's 6 members who have long service, the budgeted amount will not be enough, and we will need to find the funding, as we did in 2015, from other sources or through supplementary appropriation. If the funding is less than, if the turnover is less than 6, or if all that turnover occurs for members who have served only 4 years, then that amount will be underspent. But it's essentially a set of assumptions we have to work on, and we need to wait until the election day to see how it plays out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Green.
Thank you to the witnesses for their responses. Nothing further.
Thank you. Further to this activity? Seeing none, I will call the page. Legislative Assembly expenditures on behalf of members, operations expenditure summary, total activity $9,404,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to the next activity on page 11, Office of the Chief Electoral Office. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call this activity. Legislative Assembly, Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, Operations Expenditure Summary, Activity Total $1,655,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to the next activity, Office of the Clerk. Comments or questions? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. There's a significant increase from 2018-19 to 2019-20 in research, information, and library services. Can one of our guests here explain that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, what is being proposed for library services for the upcoming year is a one-time initiative for a digitization system. This is a move to modernize the way that the library does business in terms of digitizing all their information, being able to connect with other agencies and networks. The estimated cost for that is $100,000, and there's an additional $21,000 or $22,000 for a summer student to assist with that digitization work during the summer period.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yep, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I know over at the archives, there are actually copies of the minutes for the Northwest Territories Council going back to 1921. And they're the only record of those minutes anywhere in the world, as I understand it. And it would be great, do you know if that sort of information is part of this project? Because there are research requests, and I had a reason to go back to the 1950s recently on this. But is that going to be part of this project? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't confirm that. The library, talking with the librarian, I know that they are meeting with various groups to flesh out a plan in terms of how they're going to approach digitization. But I know that there are several groups that are involved with that.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I might go and have a chat with some of the folks in the library as well, because they provide great service to us, and it would be great to have that sort of archival information available online for research purposes as well. But I want to thank our witnesses. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further? Seeing nothing, I will call the activity. Legislative Assembly, Office of the Clerk, Operations Expenditure Summary, total activity $8,300,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee, please turn to the next activity. Office of the Speaker. Summary is on page 18. Comments, questions? Seeing none, I will call the activity. Legislative Assembly, Office of the Speaker, Operations Expenditure Summary, $531,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee, please turn to Statutory Offices on page 21. Comments or questions? Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, in his opening remarks, the Speaker said that the budget for languages was going to be tripled. I'm not sure if that is this page where the Language Commissioner is or where it's going to be, but maybe he could point to that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Well, see, Mr. Chair, the fund allocation is not geared towards the Language Commissioner's budget, but it is overall to offset how we can enhance the language development in the Legislative Assembly with regards to reporting and promoting more of language. It is a generic contribution to Legislative Assembly. It would capture the Language Commissioner's area of recommendation, so we can work towards that as well. But if I may, maybe Mercer have more detailed information pertaining to this, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up to what the Speaker said, the tripling of the Assembly's languages budget would not be found under this activity. It would be found under a number of line items under Office of the Clerk. For example, the Clerk's Office item under Program Detail has a substantial increase of about $100,000. That would account for some of it. The remainder would be in the committee's budget. So that increase is spread out over a number of items within the activity of Office of the Clerk on page 14, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing further.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I noticed here that the budgets for a couple of the statutory officers have actually decreased. The Information and Privacy Commissioner, there's $28,000 less for 2019-20, and for the Languages Commissioner, I'm not going to attempt to do the math in my head. 38, my friend tells me. So can someone explain to me why these reductions are being made? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Well, see, Mr. Chair, it is part of a shared services that we have within assistance to these officers. As you know, we have a few of them and we do have a clerk or receptionist that assists them. And there's been a reallocation of that position, but I'll get Mr. Ouellette, because we did talk about that during our deliberation of how we can deal with those positions. So I'll get Mr. Ouellette to explain more in detail. We'll see.
Thank you. Mr. Ouellette.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so the planning going forward was looking at the storefront location for the statutory offices at the Lang 1 building. Currently, on one side of that, there are 3 statutory offices that are being supported by 1.5 staff. And the commissioner is also bringing on a full-time deputy commissioner, or assistant commissioner, sorry. So with the implementation of the Ombuds office, the plan is to increase the half-time position to a full-time position, and then we reallocated some of those budgets to the Ombud budget, and that took it out of the language commissioner's budget, and also took a portion of the office manager's salaries out of the information and privacy commissioner's budget. So that's why the reduction would be seen there, but there is no impact to their operational expenses.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the explanation. So just to be crystal clear here, so there's no change in the funding that's provided to the IPC, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, or the Language Commissioner. There's no reduction in their ability to carry out program services that they do, other than the fact that the resources are being reduced to provide for a shared support person in the office. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair, yes, those are areas that we've discussed how we can manage, and that's correct, what the members alluded to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nothing further from Mr. O'Reilly. Seeing nothing further, I will call this page. Legislative Assembly, Statutory Offices, Operations Expenditure Summary, total $2,553,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. There's an information item on the last page, or rather, as part of that last item. So let's return to the departmental summary on page 5. Any final comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call the total. Legislative Assembly, total department, $22,443,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms may escort the witnesses from the chamber. Does committee agree that this concludes our consideration of the Legislative Assembly? Thank you, committee. Does committee agree that this concludes our consideration of tabled document 322-18 main estimates 2019-2020? Thank you, committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that consideration of table document 322-18 main estimates 2019-20 now be concluded, and that table document 322-18 be reported as ready for further consideration in a formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Willio. There's a motion on the floor. The motion is in order. It is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you, committee. Committee, we have agreed to next consider Committee Report 13-18 report on the review of Bill 31, the N.W.T. 911 Act. I will go to the Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations for any opening comments about the report. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On February 26, 2019, the Standing Committee on Government Operations presented its report on the review of Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act. The committee report included 3 recommendations, and I look forward to the opportunity to discuss the report and the recommendations in Committee of the Whole later today. Members of the committee may have individual comments. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. I'll open the floor to any general comments on the report. Seeing none. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do have just a few brief comments I'd like to make. I want to thank the committee for letting me sit in on a lot of the meetings that they had regarding the report. I'm quite pleased with the recommendations that came out of the report. 911 is something that was being worked on when I was on City Council back in 1997 to 2006. So this was not in our mandate, and I do appreciate the work of a couple of ministers to bring this forward, and I want to commend them for their hard work in getting this bill to us, and that this is finally going to happen in the life of this Assembly. This is very important for the people of the Northwest Territories in terms of public safety. So again, I want to thank my cabinet colleagues for their hard work on this. I still think there's a lot of work to be done, though, in terms of implementation and working very closely with our community governments, particularly here in Yellowknife, where the center is going to be located in terms of how calls are handled and so on. I guess I would take a little bit of credit for the idea of having some public reporting around 911 in terms of the revenues and the calls, number of calls and use of languages and so on. So I think those are going to be important metrics as we move forward with the implementation. But I want to recognize the work of my cabinet colleagues and keep moving this forward, and the work of the committee and improving the bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Nadley.
You say something nice about you guys?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you too, I just wanted to at least acknowledge the efforts from all sides, including the cabinet ministers that were involved with at least advancing this forward. And I think we all realize the real need for such a system to be set in place here in the Northwest Territories is basically because of the need for more public safety and, of course, emergency situations. And so therefore, it's just timely that we move forward on this. I know there's been effort from the 17th Assembly as far as previous assemblies that had wished that such a system would be in place. And now we've seen the advancement of cellular technology in small remote communities. We've seen the fiber optic line that it's been laid down from the southern parts of the N.W.T. right down to up to Nunavik. So there's a lot of hopes and expectations, and that such a service, a critical life-saving service, could be provided. There are challenges, ongoing challenges. One of them is the presumption that such a service would be namely in English, but as we all know, we have multiple official languages that we need to uphold, and so the challenge is to make a service like that could be available to everybody in the Northwest Territories. However, there are some technical challenges in terms of how we're supposed to address that. But for the most part, I'm very happy and pleased that we've made tremendous progress on this and making 911 a reality in the near future. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Nadley. Anything further to the report? Seeing none, I'll just explain to everyone what happens with these reports. There are various recommendations made to the department in the reports, and those are generally moved as motions. So if there are any recommendations which anyone would like to move as motions, I will go to that person now. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs work with the Department of Finance to develop a strategic approach designed to secure support and funding to expand cellular coverage in the Northwest Territories as part of a national cellular network. And further, that the strategic approach identify current cellular coverage along with funding needs and goals for future cellular coverage and timelines associated with system improvements. And furthermore, that the strategic approach consider appropriate ways to involve the Government of Canada, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC, and large cellular service providers such as TELUS and Bell Canada in any system improvement efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the committee has read its reports. Committee has read its report into the record, so I won't go into the full details, but it's sufficient to say a number of concerns raised by the public in our consultations and from members representing their constituencies were very clear that the bill alone could not address many of the issues that will be required for 911 coverage to be a success in the program. The committee feels very strongly that this is a life-saving program that's going to make a big difference in the lives of Northerners, but to ensure that this motion in particular addresses the need for expanded cellular coverage, especially in smaller communities and in regions where there are large stretches of road without adequate coverage. And the concern is that if there's an accident there, it won't matter if you have 911 or not if you can't get a cell signal on your phone. So it's imperative that we improve this communications infrastructure in the Northwest Territories. We can't do it alone, and this motion contemplates how the government can take concrete actions to deliver more extensive cellular service in the Northwest Territories and adequately support the life-saving goals of the 911 program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, the question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs develop a detailed municipal implementation plan that sets out the information and supports needed by each local authority to ensure successful implementation of N.W.T-wide 911 service. And further, that this implementation plan identify a realistic time frame for discussion with local authorities and that the department be prepared to adjust the go-live date to a later date, if necessary, to accommodate the consultation needs of local authorities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We spoke to many municipalities around their concerns with the implementation of 911 and how best the government can support the implementation in a way that everyone can meaningfully participate and have adequate resources. To capture that, the committee has made this recommendation to ensure that municipalities are ready and prepared for the rollout of 911, that it doesn't impact their existing provision of emergency services, and that everyone moves to a smooth transition after the 911 service goes live. And this motion contemplates it being the responsibility of the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs to develop this implementation plan in meaningful consultation with all of our communities where 911 service will be implemented. So we're hoping that this motion is carried and that this plan comes into place before the implementation of 911. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and really appreciate the work that was done by committee on the report and bringing these three motions forward, as well as the discussion that we had in committee. We know this is very important. We've got to make sure that all of our communities and our municipalities are ready and prepared when we do this implementation. And as this is a recommendation to Cabinet, we will be abstaining from the vote as previous motion. However, I just want to let committee know and members and the general public that Cabinet is very supportive in the rollout of these of the 911 services, and as it being the first year that we're going to be rolling this out, and we want to do it right, that we will be doing we'll be monitoring and evaluating the program, and we'll be committing to keeping committee apprised of the rollout of 911. And I do appreciate all the work that committee has done on the report, and as we go further into the bill later on today, the amendments that were made as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs provide a response to these the recommendations contained in this report within 120 days. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you, committee. Seeing nothing further from committee, does committee agree that we have concluded consideration of committee report 13-18(3), report on the review of Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act? Thank you, committee. That concludes our consideration of the report. We have agreed to next consider Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act. I will ask the minister responsible for the bill to introduce it, Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am pleased to introduce Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act. The purpose of the Northwest Territories 911 Act is to create a Northwest Territories 911 service for the reporting of emergencies through a public safety answering point or call center. Bill 31 requires communities, communications providers, and emergency service providers to participate in the establishment and operation of the 911 system, which is necessary for its effective operation throughout the Northwest Territories. Bill 31 authorizes development and administration of policies, standards, and guidelines that are necessary to operationalize the system, deter inappropriate use of the 911 system, and authorize the call center to perform additional work on behalf of community governments, such a direct dispatch for their emergency first responders. A significant aspect of Bill 31 is the setting of a cost recovery fee. As members of this House are aware, the goal of 911 system is to ensure it operates on a full cost recovery basis. The fee will apply to all communication devices used in the Northwest Territories which connect to 911, including landlines, wireless devices, and voice-over Internet protocol connections. Much work is underway to implement 911 throughout the Northwest Territories, including preparations for a 911 call center, hiring and training of qualified staff, working with community governments to improve civic addressing, creating an inventory of available emergency services, implementing a public awareness system, system testing, and developing an effective means to evaluate our progress. Municipal and Community Affairs has worked with the Legislative Division of the Department of Justice on Bill 31 and will continue working with them on the drafting of the regulations required to set the cost recovery fee. Municipal and Community Affairs intends to bring the Act and regulations into force prior to the go-live date for the 911 system. The projected go-live date remains June 2019. That concludes my opening remarks, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that members may have regarding Bill 31.
Thank you, Minister. At this point, we're going to call a brief recess so we can distribute the bill to members. So we'll reconvene in about 5 minutes. Thank you. I'll call committee back to order. I will now turn to the chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations, the committee that considered the bill, for opening comments. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just trying to find my paperwork here. The Standing Committee on Government Operations is pleased to report on its review of Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act. The committee read their substantive report into the House on February 26, 2019, giving details on our consultation on Bill 31. To commence its review of Bill 31, the Standing Committee on Government Operations sent letters inviting input from an extensive list of stakeholders, including all municipal and Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories and a number of non-governmental organizations. The committee held 4 public hearings on Bill 31 in Fort Smith, Inuvik, Fort McPherson, and Yellowknife. As well, the committee received 2 written submissions on the bill from the hamlet of Toledo and the city of Yellowknife. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank the communities who welcomed us on our travels and everyone who provided input on Bill 31. The clause-by-clause review was held on February 21st, 2019. At this meeting, the committee moved 3 separate motions to amend Bill 31. All 3 were carried with concurrence from the minister. And at this time, I'd like to recognize that the committee found the minister to be, and the department to be, strong partners in the development of this legislation, and sincerely appreciates that we were able to find common ground and concurrence with the motions to improve the bill by way of amendment. It is not lost on us that sometimes those differences of opinion can impact legislation, but in this case we were able to find a common vision for 911 services in the Northwest Territories and work collaboratively to achieve it. And I think it is a strong example of how to draft good legislation in this Assembly. With that, Mr. Chair, individual members may have additional comments, but I have nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, do you have witnesses you wish to bring into the chamber?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yes, I do.
Thank you. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister, please introduce your witnesses for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On my left, I have Sherry Girock, who's the Legislative Counsel for the Department of Justice. On my immediate right, Mr. Ashley Jarity, the 911 Program Manager for MACA. And on my far right, Ms. Eleanor Young, my Deputy Minister for Municipal and Community Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to the witnesses. Committee, I will open the floor to general comments on Bill 31. Seeing none, we will proceed to a clause-by-clause review. We will defer the bill number and title until after consideration of the clauses. I will call out each clause, and if committee agrees, please respond accordingly. Please turn to page 1 of the bill. Clause 1. Thank you. Clause 2. Clause 3. Clause 4. Clause 5. Clause 6. Clause 7. Clause 8. Clause 9. Clause 10. Clause 11. Clause 11.1. Clause 12. Clause 13, Clause 14. Committee, that is all the clauses. I will now call the bill number and title. Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act. Thank you, committee. Does committee agree that this concludes our consideration of Bill 31? To the bill as a whole, does committee agree that Bill 31 is now ready for third reading? Thank you, committee. Bill 31 is now ready for third reading. This concludes our consideration of the bill. I'll go to Minister Moses for some closing comments.
Just really quickly, Mr. Chair, I want to thank the previous ministers that did work on this bill. Obviously, thank my staff that did the hard work, went out and did the consultation. I'd like to thank the chair for the comments that were made before we got into the proceedings of the bill and the work that we have done collectively and when we went through the clause-by-clause review. And just like to, one thing that was important in the report was the comments from the municipal leaders, and make sure that we take that into consideration. So I just want to thank everybody involved, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us. You got a free ride today. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses from the chamber. Mr. Testart?
I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress, but first I have to thank everyone who's been working behind the scenes. I know we've had some late nights this week, and we really appreciate all the clerks, all the technicians, all the interpreters, and all the pages who've been sticking it out with us over this last little while. So thank you to everybody.
Member Hay River North, may I have the...
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Table Document 322-18-3, Main Estimates 2019-2020, and Bill 26, Statistics Act, and Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act, and Committee Report 13-18-3, Report on the Review of Bill 31. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I made a mistake here. Can I start over? Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Table Document 322-18-3, Main Estimates 2019-2020, and Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act, and Committee Report 13-18-3, Report on the Review of Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act, and would like to report progress with 4 motions carried, that Committee Report 13-18-3 is concluded, that Bill 31 is ready for third reading, that consideration of Table Document 322-18-3 is concluded, and that the House concur in those estimates, and that an appropriation bill to be based thereon be introduced without delay. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Mackenzie Delta. Motions in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Colleagues, before we adjourn today, I want to express my thanks to Gail Bennett. As many of you know, she's here with us through this session, who has assisted us again at the table in the committee during this session. Gail, our clerk staff, will be up to strength by the next setting, so this may not be your last appearance at that table, but may not. I just want to say thank you on behalf of our colleagues here in the House for helping us ensure the uninterrupted and high level of procedural support in this House and also at the committees. You're always welcome here, and we wish you well, and I hope that it is a serious effort at retirement. Mercy for all the services over the years, and you're always welcome here. Orders of the day, Madam Clerk.
Indaize edani legeti ha weketi. Edaizek deton choza huno datson ile. Nakelemi huno datson fluton ho hunte. Infle tani ni on. Hayat eti kawode hayati ek etetodo hayati indi kawode dawet inke ile godson nagode. Haton goga gekwe gizi hat edi asi wek edzon at ei. Kawode da gets eke nitle ta da et eke indi nitle ta da et ike ile godson nagogede. Commissioner Weatik Hayat Eti Goizit Asit Eke Standing Aids on Special Committees on Amigo di Wetson Nawode Wego Ginda Wego di Done Ala Niple Gigada Ha Negele Nawo Wek Edzon Ra Yati Nita Aqueflo Nawo Nitle Wek Edzon Ra Hats Edi Nawo Hotle Aqueflo nawo nitle wek eti Bill 46 nank son nawo nitle wek eti Bill 44 Bill 45 nawont ala wego leslegedi nanke son nawo nitle wek eti Bill 44 Bill 45 nawont ala Wego Leslegediga Ho'o. Bill 30, Committee Report 12-18-3, Minister Statement 131-18-3, Minister Statement 151-18-3, Minister Statement 158-18-3, Table Document 237-18-3. Edani Legedi Wego Hagedi Taitson Nawo Nitle Wek Eti, Bill 26 and Bill 31. Indaidze Edani Legedi Ha Wek Eti. And there will be a public Board of Management meeting in Committee Room A at the Rise of the House.
Merci. Did they get at the Nahun and that's at the other Monday, March 11, 2019 in Shatani.